I did not write this at the time of the events, nor shortly after. The distance between experience and articulation was not a matter of hesitation but of necessity. Certain things resist immediate transcription, not because they are unclear, but because clarity itself carries risk. What follows was set down only after years of internal containment, when memory had stabilized into something fixed and unyielding. This document was never requested, commissioned, or sanctioned. No file number attaches to it. No authority has reviewed it. It exists outside the formal record by design, because inclusion would have required interpretation, and interpretation would have altered the nature of what occurred. I have preserved it as plainly as possible, without embellishment, because excess detail invites misreading. At the time of the assignment, I was a professional operating well within the boundaries of training and procedure. I trusted structure, hierarchy, and explanation. I believed that anomalies resolved under scrutiny, that attention clarified rather than distorted. That belief was not naive. It was functional, and it had served me without incident for years. The location in question was considered unremarkable by any operational standard. It did not carry a history of incidents beyond those expected of remote terrain. No standing advisories applied. No special classifications existed. My assignment there was routine, and I accepted it without reservation or expectation. The initial reports that preceded direct involvement were inconclusive by design. They did not compel action. They accumulated slowly, each insufficient on its own, yet together forming a pattern that resisted dismissal. At the time, I interpreted this accumulation as noise rather than signal, an error I note here only to establish baseline judgment. I want to be clear that I did not seek explanation beyond procedure. I did not speculate. I did not attribute meaning where none was required. Every step I took followed established protocol until protocol itself ceased to offer adequate guidance. The deviation that followed was not chosen. It emerged from necessity. What unfolded did so incrementally, under conditions that encouraged compliance rather than alarm. There were no dramatic ruptures at the outset, no overt violations of expectation. The process depended on gradual alignment, on allowing perception to adjust until resistance diminished. I did not recognize the nature of that alignment until it had progressed beyond reversal. That recognition did not arrive as fear, but as certainty. The difference matters. Fear suggests reaction. Certainty implies correction already underway. This account is arranged chronologically, divided into discrete sections to preserve sequence and escalation. The structure reflects how the experience asserted itself, not as a single event, but as a progression governed by internal thresholds rather than external markers. I have avoided speculation regarding origin, classification, or purpose beyond what was directly observed. To do otherwise would impose frameworks that were neither invited nor relevant. The intelligence encountered did not present itself for analysis. It presented itself for acknowledgement. The language used here is deliberately restrained. Where description becomes precise, it does so because precision was unavoidable at the time. Where silence appears, it reflects boundaries encountered rather than omissions made. Nothing essential has been removed. This introduction serves only to establish context and intent. It does not prepare the reader, nor should it. Preparation implies defense. No defense was applicable. What follows records how attention itself became the vector through which consequence was applied. I submit this account not as testimony for evaluation, but as containment. Once written, it can remain fixed, no longer requiring active maintenance within memory. That is its only purpose. What was seen, and what was recognized, requires no further amplification to remain fully and permanently present. I am setting this down as a personal record, written without authorization, and stored where it will not be indexed. I do not claim it for any purpose except to keep my own account straight, because the official paper trail was altered in small ways that, taken together, erased the shape of what happened. I was assigned to the backcountry in Idaho in the spring of 2000 under routine authority, with ordinary duties and ordinary expectations, and I carried myself as a man who believed the world stayed within its own borders. My post was a remote section of timber and drainage that rarely drew attention outside of fire season: long ridges, steep draws, old logging spurs that fell into disuse, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear your own boots argue with gravel. The station itself was a small government structure with a radio set, paper maps, and a metal cabinet that always smelled faintly of oil and damp canvas. My assignment was not heroic. It was patrol, prevention, and paperwork, with an occasional welfare check on dispersed campers and a steady watch for anything that could turn into flame. I had been trained to treat reports as either reliable or explainable. Most things are explainable. Lights in the woods are often hunters, or someone running a generator, or a vehicle where it should not be, or a simple trick of distance that makes a headlamp look like a hovering star. I did not consider myself easily impressed. I had listened to too many stories told by people who wanted them to be something more, and I had learned to locate the practical center of a situation and stand there until the noise around it died down. The first mention of lights reached me through an afternoon call from a county dispatcher, stated in the flat tone used for small problems. A man near a rural road had called in to say he'd seen a bluish flare deep back in, fixed in one place for several minutes and then gone. The dispatcher did not ask for a response. She only asked if I wanted the note. I took it and wrote it down out of habit, and I remember thinking that it would never appear again, because most notes do not. Over the next week the notes multiplied in small, inconvenient increments. A family in a camper reported a pale glow beyond the tree line, low to the ground, with no sound of engine or voices. A volunteer with the local search and rescue group mentioned that on a previous night he had watched a thin white radiance through binoculars, as if someone had set a lamp in the middle of a slope where there was no road and no clearing. None of these reports included heat, smoke, or the hard edge of fire. They were all the same in one detail: the light did not move as a person would carry it, and it did not sweep or wander the way a beam does. On my first patrol out toward the reported area, I found nothing that deserved a line in an incident log. No fresh tire marks, no makeshift camp, no evidence of illegal activity. The forest floor showed the usual confusion of deer sign, fallen needles, and old prints softened by time. The air had that clean, metallic smell that comes after a morning frost gives up. I stood for a while in a draw where sound travels strangely, listening for the telltale click of a generator or the cough of a vehicle. I heard only wind and distant water and the thin creak of trees settling into their own weight. I approached it as I approached everything: map, compass, patience. I plotted the report locations against the terrain and found they shared no obvious focal point. The angles were wrong. A stationary light in the woods can be triangulated by any two observers with a steady reference. These accounts, taken together, did not converge the way they should have. It was as if each witness had been allowed a view from where they stood and no more, and the thing itself, whatever produced the glow, had remained just outside the kind of certainty that creates immediate action. The first time I saw anything myself was not dramatic. It occurred at dusk, during the ordinary transition when shadows lengthen and the forest begins to conceal what it had shown all day. I was on a ridge line, looking down into timbered country, when a dim pearl-colored gleam appeared between trunks far below. It was not bright. It was not a beam. It did not fan out or strike objects in a cone. It sat in the understory like a thought held in place, present for long enough that my eyes could adjust to it, then thinned until it was indistinguishable from the general darkness. I did not report it immediately, because there was nothing to report that would not sound like a confession of inattentive nerves. Instead, I returned to the station and reviewed the equipment logs, confirming that there were no authorized crews running night operations in that zone. I checked the fire cache, the radio register, and the maintenance schedule. Everything was normal. That is what made the light's brief appearance feel less like an anomaly and more like an intrusion, not violent, not threatening in any overt sense, but out of place in the way a door left open at night is out of place. 2 days later, a sealed envelope arrived with routine mail, addressed to the station but not stamped in a way I recognized. The return field was blank. Inside was a single typed page requesting confirmation of my duty status and asking that I make myself available for federal inquiry related to aerial illumination reports. The phrasing was careful, neither a request nor a command, but it carried the weight of something that assumed compliance. I read it twice and felt an irritation that was, at the time, purely professional. My area had lights now, and lights had apparently produced interest above my pay grade. They came the following morning in a vehicle without markings, clean enough to look out of place on the gravel approach. 2 men stepped out, dressed in dark coats despite the weather, their appearance plain in a way that made description difficult afterward. They presented credentials too quickly for me to absorb, the cards held at the exact angle that catches glare and discourages scrutiny. Their manner was calm, practiced, and entirely free of curiosity about anything except the lights. They did not introduce themselves by name. They spoke as if names were unnecessary, and as if the station itself belonged to them for the duration of their questions. They asked for my logs. They asked for the times and directions of every report. They asked what color the lights were, how long they persisted, whether they pulsed, whether they drifted, whether they cast shadow. They asked whether I had ever been closer than a mile. They asked whether I had attempted to approach. Their questions were specific enough to suggest they already knew the answers they wanted, and what they wanted was not a story but a set of measurements. When I told them that most witnesses described the glow as low, fixed, and silent, one of them wrote a note without looking down, as if he could form letters by memory alone. I remained composed, because composition is what the job demands, but I noticed something as the interview continued. Neither man asked about people. They did not ask if I had seen trespassers, or if there were signs of poaching, or if there had been theft or vandalism. Their interest was the light itself, not what a light usually means in the forest. When I offered the most ordinary explanation, campers, headlamps, a distant vehicle turned at a strange angle, the taller one looked at me with an expression that was neither disagreement nor amusement. It was the look of a person confirming that you are still living inside the assumptions he has come to correct. After they left, the station felt altered in a way I could not justify on paper. Nothing had been moved, yet the air carried the impression of having been handled, like a room after an inspection where authority lingers longer than footsteps. I returned the logs to the cabinet and locked it, though there was no regulation requiring it. The act was reflexive, a small attempt to reassert boundary. Outside, the forest resumed its ordinary posture, indifferent to my unease, and that indifference unsettled me more than any overt sign would have. The following days stretched with a new density. Time did not slow, but it thickened, each hour packed with a vigilance I had not known before. I patrolled more deliberately, pausing at vantage points longer than necessary, listening beyond the useful range of hearing. The woods remained quiet in the way they always had, yet that quiet now felt curated, as if the absence of sound were being maintained rather than naturally occurring. I wrote nothing of this, because there is no place for suspicion of silence in an official record. At night, the station seemed farther from everything. The radio crackled with distant traffic, routine check-ins that proved the world continued elsewhere, but the darkness outside the windows felt pressed close, intimate. I found myself checking the perimeter more than once, stepping out with a flashlight whose beam behaved correctly, obediently, illuminating what it was pointed at and nothing more. I told myself this was professional thoroughness, but the truth sat beneath it, unacknowledged. I was confirming that light still worked the way it should. The lights returned without warning, and without spectacle. I saw them first from the same ridge line, at nearly the same hour, as if whatever governed their appearance respected pattern enough to repeat it. This time there were 2, separated by distance but identical in character, low and steady, pale enough to feel cold. They did not brighten or dim. They did not flicker. They simply occupied space, present in the understory like objects that had always belonged there and had only now been noticed. I watched them longer than before, long enough for the initial urge to explain to exhaust itself. My eyes adjusted fully, and the surrounding forest resolved into layers of trunk and shadow, none of which reflected the glow in any predictable way. There was no spill, no halo. The light did not behave as illumination so much as a surface quality, as if the air itself had been altered in two precise locations. When they faded, they did so evenly, not retreating but thinning, until they were indistinguishable from absence. Isolation began to assert itself not as loneliness but as exposure. I was alone with a thing that did not announce itself and did not care whether it was understood. I attempted to ground myself in procedure, returning to the station to note times and bearings, drawing lines on a map that still refused to meet. The geometry was wrong again, and that wrongness pressed against me, subtle but persistent, like a misalignment in the inner ear that never quite resolves. Sleep became shallow. I woke frequently, not from dreams but from a sense of interruption, as if something had paused nearby and then moved on. There were no sounds to justify it. My body responded anyway, heart elevated, breath measured too carefully. In the morning, I attributed it to stress, to the presence of federal interest, to the ordinary strain of remote duty. These explanations were true enough to function, and that was their danger. They allowed me to continue without acknowledging the growing fracture beneath routine. Another report came in from a volunteer fire watcher stationed miles away. He did not embellish. He simply stated that he had seen a single light below his tower, stationary for several minutes, and that during that time he had experienced an overwhelming reluctance to look away from it. He said this last part as if it embarrassed him. I told him it was likely fatigue, the way eyes fixate on contrast in low light. He accepted the explanation too quickly, grateful for it, and ended the call. Warnings arrived indirectly, folded into casual remarks. A local deputy mentioned, without emphasis, that people were avoiding certain forest roads at night, choosing longer routes rather than pass through areas where nothing had ever happened. A hiker I stopped for a permit check asked me, with forced lightness, whether the quiet spots were safe after dark. When I asked what he meant, he shrugged and said only that some places felt watched. I noted his name and vehicle, and then watched him leave, uneasy with how closely his words matched my own unrecorded thoughts. The environment itself began to feel fractionally misaligned. Animals were present, but their movement patterns shifted in ways too small to alarm yet too consistent to ignore. Birds flushed earlier than expected. Deer crossed open ground with abruptness, as if responding to a stimulus I could not perceive. I told myself this was seasonal variance, that my attention had sharpened and was therefore misattributing significance. Still, I began to feel that the forest was accommodating something, making room in ways that did not require disruption. I returned to the ridge line again, compelled by a mixture of duty and a need I did not examine. The lights appeared once more, 3 this time, arranged without symmetry yet clearly intentional. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion. My hands trembled slightly, a fine motor instability that annoyed me more than it frightened me. I forced my breathing into a steady rhythm, aware of the effort it took to maintain control, aware also that the effort itself was being observed by something that did not need to breathe at all. When the lights vanished, the darkness that replaced them felt heavier than before, as if it had been waiting. I stood there longer than was wise, unwilling to turn my back on the place they had occupied. The fear was not of sudden attack, not of movement or sound, but of the act of disengagement itself. To look away felt like consent. To keep looking felt like an invitation. I chose neither, standing frozen between options until the cold forced me to move, and even then I left reluctantly, with the distinct and unwelcome sense that my departure had been noted. The days that followed were marked by small disruptions that would have been meaningless in isolation. My compass needle hesitated before settling, a delay so brief it could be dismissed as imagination, yet it occurred often enough that I began to notice the pause rather than the reading. The radio suffered intermittent interference, a soft, steady hiss that overlaid clear channels without obscuring them, as if something were present alongside the signal rather than interrupting it. Maintenance checks revealed no faults. Each anomaly resolved itself before it could be formally addressed. I adjusted my patrol routes to include areas suggested by the overlapping reports, moving through sections of forest I had previously passed without thought. The terrain was familiar, but familiarity had thinned. Trees stood where they always had, yet the spacing between them felt altered, as though depth had been subtly recalibrated. Distances were harder to judge. Slopes appeared shallower until climbed, then steeper than expected. My body compensated instinctively, but the constant correction left me faintly nauseous, a low-grade physical unease that lingered even at rest. Sound behaved inconsistently. In some draws, noise carried with unnatural clarity, a snapped twig echoed as if in a confined space. In others, my own footsteps seemed absorbed entirely, leaving me with the disquieting sensation of moving without presence. Wind shifted without warning, changing direction sharply, then falling dead. These were not storms or fronts, nothing that would justify abrupt transitions. The forest was not restless. It was selective. I found marks one afternoon along an old spur road, impressions in soft earth that did not match any vehicle or animal I knew. They were elongated depressions, deeper at one end, shallow at the other, arranged in a spacing that suggested stride rather than wheelbase. I crouched to examine them and felt an unexpected resistance, a pressure behind my eyes, as if the act of focused observation itself were being discouraged. I straightened quickly, heart racing, annoyed at my own reaction. The marks did not continue in a line. They appeared, vanished, and reappeared several yards away, as though whatever made them had chosen when to be tangible. I photographed them, though the images later proved unhelpful, the details flattened into ambiguity. On the ground, they carried a weight that did not translate. I filled the impressions with soil before leaving, a decision I could not later justify except as an instinctive attempt to undo something that should not have been there. That evening, I noticed that the lights were no longer the only irregularity. The darkness between trees seemed denser in certain pockets, absorbing the glow of my flashlight rather than reflecting it. When I swept the beam across these areas, the light thinned and dulled, as if passing through a medium thicker than air. The effect vanished the moment I tried to focus on it directly, leaving me uncertain whether I had seen anything at all. Sleep brought no images, only pressure. I woke with my jaw clenched and my muscles locked, breath shallow and controlled with deliberate effort. There was no sense of being chased, no narrative to the fear. It existed without context, a response waiting for its stimulus. In the morning, I found myself cataloging the station with unnecessary precision, aligning objects, confirming inventories, asserting order in a way that bordered on compulsion. A second sealed envelope arrived, again without a return address. This one contained a brief acknowledgement of my previous cooperation and a reminder that further communication would be initiated if required. There was no signature. The phrasing suggested closure, yet the timing felt premature, as if the matter were being declared contained before it had fully presented itself. I placed the letter in a drawer and did not log it. On patrol the following day, I encountered a local trapper I had known for years, a man whose assessments I trusted because they were rarely embellished. He asked, without preamble, whether I had noticed the pauses. When I asked him to clarify, he hesitated, then said only that the woods felt as though they were waiting for instructions. He laughed afterward, a short, uncomfortable sound, and apologized for speaking strangely. We parted quickly, neither of us interested in prolonging the exchange. The lights appeared again that night, closer than before. They occupied a lower slope within clearer view, their pale surfaces resolving more distinctly against the trunks. I watched from cover, pulse steady only because I forced it to be. There was no movement, no approach, yet I felt the unmistakable sensation of alignment, as if my presence had completed a configuration. My mouth went dry. My hands shook despite the cold. For the first time, I understood that these appearances were not random manifestations but deliberate events, staged with consideration for position and witness. The realization brought a tightening behind my sternum and a faint ringing in my ears. The forest did not feel hostile. It felt attentive. I withdrew slowly, careful not to break branches or alter rhythm, aware that the act of retreat itself was being measured. When I reached the station, I locked the door behind me and stood listening, acutely conscious of my own breathing, and of the possibility that something beyond the walls was listening too. Confirmation came not through authority but through reluctance. A call was routed to me from a neighboring district, a ranger I had trained with years earlier, a man whose restraint bordered on severity. He spoke carefully, choosing each word as if aware that language itself could carry consequence. He said he had been advised not to file a formal report, and that the advice had not come from anyone whose name he was permitted to record. What he described matched my own observations closely enough that I felt a tightening along my spine before he finished speaking. He had seen the lights from a distance, pale and unmoving, arranged in a pattern that made sense only from where he stood. He had attempted to change position, to gain a different angle, and had found that the configuration dissolved the moment he did so. When he returned to his original vantage, the lights reappeared, unchanged. He told me this without drama, but his voice carried a fatigue that did not belong to a single incident. It belonged to something prolonged and unresolved. He did not ask me what I thought they were. Instead, he asked whether anyone had contacted me already. When I told him yes, there was a pause long enough that I checked the connection. He then said, quietly, that he had been instructed to cease night patrols in his sector, for unrelated operational reasons. No such instruction had reached me. The discrepancy lodged itself in my thoughts, an asymmetry that resisted explanation. The call ended abruptly, without the usual exchange of closing remarks. I sat for some time afterward, the receiver still warm in my hand, aware that something had shifted from solitary experience into shared knowledge. This did not bring relief. It brought weight. Whatever was occurring was no longer confined to my perception, and that meant it had moved beyond the realm where it could be dismissed as error. Warnings began to take form, though never directly. A regional memo circulated reminding field personnel to prioritize safety and to avoid unnecessary engagement with unidentified nocturnal phenomena. The language was deliberately vague, applicable to everything and nothing. It did not mention lights. It did not mention my district. It did, however, emphasize discretion and internal handling, phrases that in practice meant silence. I found myself measuring my own behavior against imagined scrutiny. I altered routes, then altered them back, uncertain whether predictability or variation was safer. I limited radio transmissions to essentials. I reduced written notes, keeping details in my head where they could not be requested or redacted. This self-censorship did not feel imposed. It felt anticipated, as if I were complying with a standard that had not yet been articulated. The forest responded in subtle ways. Paths I knew well seemed to close behind me, the sense of passage narrowing until forward movement felt like intrusion. At times, I experienced the distinct impression that the land itself was withholding orientation, offering just enough information to proceed but no more. This was not disorientation in the usual sense. I always knew where I was. What I lacked was permission. One evening, while reviewing maps, I noticed that several of the reported light locations corresponded loosely to boundaries, changes in elevation, shifts in vegetation, old survey lines now overgrown. These were not borders marked on modern maps, but they carried a residue of demarcation, as if the land remembered being divided. The realization brought with it a wave of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I returned to the field the next night despite an internal resistance that bordered on physical pain. My legs felt heavy before I reached the ridge, my breath shallow and carefully regulated. When the lights appeared, they did so with an immediacy that suggested expectation. There were 4 now, arranged with deliberate spacing, their pale surfaces resolving just enough to assert form without detail. I felt a pressure behind my eyes and fought the urge to blink, aware that even momentary blindness might be noted. For the first time, I sensed not just presence but assessment. The lights did not react to my stillness or my breathing. They existed independently of my actions, yet their timing was too precise to be coincidental. I understood then that I was not observing an event. I was participating in a process, one that required my attention in order to proceed. When I withdrew, the act felt less like retreat and more like dismissal. I was allowed to leave. The distinction mattered. It followed me back to the station, settling into my thoughts with a certainty that eroded sleep and hollowed appetite. I began to feel that the warnings I had received, indirect and deniable as they were, had not been intended to protect me from harm. They had been intended to manage my awareness. By the time dawn arrived, I was no longer certain that continued rationality would serve as insulation. The world I had trusted to remain stable under observation was demonstrating its capacity to respond, selectively, to being noticed. The realization did not produce panic. It produced compliance, a slow and suffocating acceptance that some thresholds, once approached, assert their own authority regardless of intent. The warnings became more personal, though they were never delivered in words. I began to feel them in my body before I could articulate them in thought. A tightening in my throat when I considered certain routes. A dull ache behind the eyes when I lingered too long at known vantage points. These sensations did not escalate into pain, they functioned as limits, gentle but insistent, like pressure applied just short of injury. I recognized them as deterrents, and the recognition itself carried unease. I attempted to resume routine inspections, telling myself that consistency was a form of defense. Yet each time I approached the areas associated with the lights, my focus fractured. Peripheral vision seemed to dominate, drawing my attention away from the center of my gaze. I found myself scanning without choosing to, my eyes pulled toward gaps between trees, toward empty spaces that felt charged despite their apparent vacancy. The effort required to maintain forward attention left me drained. One afternoon, I encountered a set of survey stakes I did not recall placing or seeing before. They were old, weathered, driven deep, their markings faded beyond legibility. They formed a rough arc along a slope that overlooked a drainage where the lights had appeared most frequently. I stood among them with a sensation of trespass that had no legal basis. The land was public. My authority was clear. Still, my presence felt provisional, as if I were standing within a designation that predated my assignment. The radio interference intensified near that location. Voices flattened into monotone, then returned abruptly to clarity without transition. I tested multiple frequencies with the same result. The effect did not extend beyond a narrow area. When I stepped back, the signal normalized. The boundary was precise enough to be intentional. I noted the coordinates mentally and resisted the urge to mark them on paper. At night, the station itself no longer felt neutral. Its walls seemed thinner, not physically but perceptually, as though whatever governed the forest's selective attention did not end at the threshold of constructed space. I caught myself lowering my voice when alone, an absurd precaution that nonetheless felt necessary. The sound of my own movement seemed amplified, while external sounds receded, leaving me isolated within a pocket of awareness. The lights began to appear earlier, sometimes before full dark, their pale forms faint but unmistakable against the deepening shadows. They did not announce themselves. They simply arrived, occupying space with the same quiet authority as before. On one occasion, I counted 5, arranged in a way that suggested relation without forming any recognizable pattern. The sight produced a wave of nausea that forced me to sit, my breathing shallow and controlled to prevent escalation. I noticed then that my fear was not of harm in the conventional sense. There was no sense of imminent attack, no anticipation of violence. Instead, the fear centered on comprehension. Each appearance brought with it a clarity that felt dangerous, a sense that understanding was being offered incrementally, not as a gift but as a test. The idea lodged in my mind that to fully grasp what I was seeing would require a concession I was not prepared to make. A directive arrived from the regional office advising reduced field presence after dusk, citing budgetary constraints and staffing adjustments. The explanation was thin, but it provided cover. I complied outwardly while continuing limited patrols under the justification of equipment checks. The discrepancy between instruction and action weighed on me, yet I could not bring myself to withdraw entirely. Avoidance felt like an admission that carried its own risk. During one such patrol, I became aware of movement at the edge of sight, not light but shadow, a density that shifted independently of the surrounding darkness. When I turned directly toward it, there was nothing to see. The absence was complete, as if the forest had erased a detail before I could confirm it. My heart rate spiked, then settled, leaving a residual tremor in my hands that took minutes to subside. The realization came gradually, not as a sudden insight but as an accumulation of small certainties. The lights were not signals meant to be discovered. They were indicators, markers of attention, appearing only when observation reached a particular threshold. They did not draw witnesses indiscriminately. They selected them. This understanding did not bring relief. It brought the oppressive weight of inevitability. I found myself rehearsing what I would say if questioned again by those men, choosing phrases that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. Yet no further contact came. Their absence felt deliberate, as if their role had concluded once my awareness reached a certain depth. The management of the situation had shifted inward, placed squarely on my capacity to endure without resolution. By the end of that week, my sense of professional confidence had eroded into something narrower and more fragile. I still performed my duties. I still followed procedure where it applied. But beneath these actions ran a current of restraint, a knowledge that some lines, once approached, resist being crossed not through force but through the steady application of pressure. I had not yet crossed such a line. I could feel it ahead of me, waiting, defined not by location but by recognition. The first true visual observation occurred without the lights as prelude, and that absence unsettled me more than their presence ever had. I was positioned along a familiar overlook shortly after dusk, the forest below settling into layered darkness, when I noticed a disruption in depth that did not belong to shadow. It was not movement at first, but a refusal of the background to remain consistent, as if a portion of the landscape had been cut out and replaced with something that approximated distance without fully achieving it. I adjusted my stance and brought binoculars up slowly, aware of the care required in such moments. The act of focusing produced a tightening in my chest that bordered on pain. What resolved in the lenses was not light, but form, tall, upright, and partially obscured by trunks that should have concealed it completely. The figure occupied space incorrectly. It was too present for its distance, too defined for the available light. I lowered the binoculars and looked again with the naked eye, confirming that the perception held. The figure remained. It did not shift or retreat when observed directly. Instead, it appeared to accept scrutiny, standing with a stillness that felt intentional rather than cautious. My breath caught, and I had to consciously regulate it, drawing air in measured increments to avoid the tremor that threatened to climb into my hands. The silhouette suggested a humanoid arrangement, but the proportions resisted easy classification. The shoulders were set wider than a man's, sloping at an angle that implied strength without bulk. The limbs were elongated, hanging with a relaxed precision that conveyed balance rather than fatigue. There was no visible sway, no adjustment of posture. It stood as if anchored, part of the terrain yet distinct from it. As my eyes adjusted further, surface detail emerged. The skin, or what passed for it, appeared dark and matte, absorbing what little ambient light reached it. There was no reflection, no sheen. The texture looked thick, uneven, not furred in any recognizable way, but not smooth either. It carried the impression of something grown rather than worn, a surface adapted for exposure rather than protection. The head was angled slightly, not toward me, but not away. The face resolved slowly, reluctantly, as if resisting being fully seen. The structure was wrong in subtle ways, the skull elongated, the jaw set too far back, the mouth a narrow line that did not part or move. The eyes were the most difficult to accept. They did not shine. They did not glow. They existed as darker voids within the face, yet I knew with an immediacy that bypassed reason that they were fixed on me. The realization produced a wave of physical response that I struggled to contain. My legs felt weak, my balance uncertain, as if gravity itself had shifted. A sour taste rose in my mouth, and my vision narrowed at the edges. I forced myself to remain upright, aware that collapse would mark a loss of control I could not afford. The fear was not explosive. It was compressive, squeezing inward, reducing my world to breath and sight. The figure did not advance. It did not retreat. It did not signal or threaten. Its power lay in its restraint, in the knowledge that it did not need to move to assert dominance. I became acutely aware of my own visibility, of the contrast between my controlled breathing and the absolute stillness before me. The understanding formed, unbidden and complete. This thing was aware of observation and had chosen to permit it. I did not name it then. Naming felt premature, a step that would solidify something that might yet be retracted. Instead, I catalogued details with the cold precision of training, clinging to description as a lifeline. Height beyond any known animal in the region. Posture upright, balanced, deliberate. Presence unmistakable, unhidden. Each detail carried weight, pressing against the boundaries of what I had accepted as possible. The encounter lasted no more than a minute, though time felt distorted, stretched thin and brittle. Without any visible transition, the figure was no longer there. It did not step away. It did not fade. The space it had occupied simply returned to forest, depth restored, shadows behaving as they should have all along. The sudden normalcy was disorienting, leaving me swaying, unsure which state had been the intrusion. I remained in place long after it vanished, afraid to move, afraid to confirm that I was alone again. The silence pressed close, heavy and expectant. When I finally turned back toward the station, I did so with the careful deliberation of someone withdrawing from a fragile boundary. I understood then that the lights had been preparation, an acclimation to attention. This had been the first true allowance, and it carried with it the certainty that what had been seen could not be unseen without consequence. The days following that sighting were marked by a sustained pressure that did not ease with distance or daylight. I carried the image with me not as a memory but as a condition, a constant adjustment my body made without instruction. My hands trembled when I attempted fine tasks. My appetite diminished to the point of nausea. I found myself counting breaths unconsciously, regulating intake and release as if oxygen itself required permission. I became acutely sensitive to my own visibility. The idea that I could be seen without knowing when or from where pressed against my thoughts until it felt physical. I avoided open ground, then realized the avoidance itself felt conspicuous. Trees no longer offered comfort. Their vertical lines seemed less like shelter and more like markers, places from which observation could occur unnoticed. The forest had not changed. My relationship to it had. Sleep no longer refreshed. I drifted in shallow cycles, waking repeatedly with the same sensation of having been interrupted mid-thought. There were no dreams to explain the disturbance. My eyes opened to darkness already familiar, my heart already elevated. I lay still, listening for confirmation that nothing else occupied the space with me, and finding no reassurance in the silence. At work, I noticed delays in my responses, a fraction of a second between stimulus and action. It was not enough to be visible to others, but I felt it keenly. My body hesitated as if awaiting instruction from something other than conscious intent. I checked my pulse more than once, grounding myself in physical metrics, reminding myself that fear alone could produce such symptoms. The explanation did not diminish their intensity. I avoided the overlook where the figure had appeared, yet its absence there felt deliberate, as if my avoidance had been anticipated. The forest did not present alternatives. Wherever I went, I felt the same pressure, the same careful attention applied just below awareness. It was not pursuit. It was containment. When the lights returned, they did so without warning and without increase in number. Two appeared, positioned lower than before, nearer the edge of a clearing I knew well. I watched from concealment, my muscles rigid, my breathing controlled to the point of discomfort. The lights did not shift. They did not brighten. They waited. The fear that settled over me was not of what might happen next, but of what was already occurring. I understood then that the lights were no longer the focus. They were markers, confirmations that the process continued. The true pressure came from the memory of the figure, from the certainty that it had observed my reaction and recorded it with precision. I experienced a sudden weakness in my legs that forced me to kneel. The ground felt unstable beneath my hands, not physically but perceptually, as if my sense of balance had detached from my body. A wave of nausea rose, sharp and immediate, and I fought it down through sheer concentration. The effort left me drained, hollowed, aware that my endurance was being measured. My thoughts narrowed. Long-term considerations vanished, replaced by immediate calculations: how long I could remain still, how much sound my movement would produce, whether retreat now would constitute a failure I did not understand. I became afraid of choosing incorrectly, not because of consequence I could define, but because the choice itself felt observed. For the first time, I felt the urge to look away while simultaneously knowing that doing so would be a mistake. The tension between these impulses was excruciating. My eyes burned from unblinking focus. My neck stiffened. I sensed that attention itself had become a currency, that where it was directed mattered more than why. The lights extinguished without transition, leaving the clearing darker than it had been before their appearance. The absence felt heavier than presence, as if something essential had been withdrawn. I remained kneeling, hands pressed into cold soil, my breath shaking despite my efforts to steady it. When I finally stood and withdrew, my movements were slow, deliberate, stripped of anything that might resemble urgency. I understood then that fear was no longer a response to events but a condition imposed by proximity to understanding. The bodily reactions, the psychological pressure, the narrowing of choice, all were components of a system I had entered simply by seeing, and by continuing to look. I returned to the overlook in daylight, compelled by a need to confirm that the place itself still existed as it should. The forest appeared unchanged, yet the familiarity rang hollow. The ground where I had stood was ordinary soil and stone, marked only by my own boot prints. There was no residue, no sign of disturbance. The absence of evidence did not reassure me. It reinforced the understanding that whatever I had seen did not require impact to be real. That night, the sighting progressed beyond ambiguity. The lights did not appear first. Instead, the forest seemed to thin in one specific corridor, depth compressing until distance collapsed into a narrow band. I felt the pressure before I saw anything, a constriction behind the eyes and a heaviness in my chest that made each breath deliberate. I knew where to look without choosing to know. The figure emerged into partial visibility at the edge of that compression, closer than before but still separated by distance. It did not step forward. It allowed the environment to adjust around it, revealing just enough of its form to eliminate doubt. The upright posture was unmistakable now, the proportions clearly non-human despite their echo of familiarity. It stood with a balance that suggested patience rather than readiness. I could see the surface of its body more clearly. The skin appeared layered, thickened in places as if reinforced, with irregular patterns that caught no light. It was neither fur nor scale, but something denser, matte and dry, bearing the impression of age without decay. There was no visible rise and fall of breath. The body did not betray effort or strain. The head angled slightly, a controlled adjustment that confirmed intent. The face resolved enough to reveal structure, a flattened plane where a human face would project, the features arranged incorrectly yet with disturbing coherence. The eyes, set deeper than expected, remained dark and reflective of nothing, yet their focus was undeniable. They were fixed on me with an attention that felt deliberate, appraising. I felt my stomach clench, a sharp, involuntary contraction that left me momentarily breathless. My hands went numb, fingers tingling as circulation shifted. The cold I felt was internal, spreading outward from my core, a physiological response to something my mind could not fully categorize. I remained standing only because I locked my knees and forced my posture into rigidity. The figure's limbs were longer than they should have been, the arms hanging low with an ease that suggested strength held in reserve. The hands were indistinct at that distance, but their position implied articulation rather than paw or claw. Nothing about its stance was aggressive. That restraint was more unsettling than any overt threat could have been. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It adjusted only once more, a subtle shift of weight that altered the distribution of shadow across its form. The movement was silent, smooth, and economical, the kind of motion that wastes nothing. I understood then that it was capable of action far beyond what it demonstrated, and that the limitation was self-imposed. The realization that it was choosing how much to reveal struck with physical force. My vision narrowed. A ringing filled my ears, steady and low. I became acutely aware of the act of standing upright, of occupying space, of being visible. The fear was not of injury. It was of misalignment, of being present in a way that violated an unspoken condition. For a brief moment, I considered raising my binoculars again, attempting to force detail from distance. The thought alone produced a spike of panic so sharp I abandoned it instantly. I understood without articulation that magnification would constitute escalation, a breach of whatever allowance was being granted. Recognition had limits. I was already close to exceeding them. The figure remained until my awareness reached saturation, until the strain of continued observation became unsustainable. Then, without movement or sound, it ceased to be where it was. The space it had occupied reasserted itself, depth returning as if nothing had ever stood there. The transition was seamless, leaving no trace except the afterimage burned into my perception. I did not move for several minutes. When I finally did, my legs shook violently, threatening collapse. I steadied myself against a tree, my breathing shallow and uneven despite conscious control. I understood then that this was no longer a distant phenomenon. It had allowed itself to be seen clearly, and in doing so, it had advanced the process beyond any point I could retreat from by choice alone. After that clearer sighting, the understanding settled with a certainty that resisted doubt. What I had seen was not reacting to chance or intrusion. It was responding to recognition. The sequence of appearances, the measured escalation of clarity, the careful management of distance, all of it pointed toward an intelligence that anticipated perception and regulated it. I began, reluctantly, to accept that the lights and the figure were not separate phenomena but stages of the same deliberate engagement. I found myself giving it a designation in thought, not as an act of belief but of necessity. To continue thinking without a reference point had become impossible. I named it, creature name or designation, and the act felt heavier than any label I had ever applied in my work. The name did not clarify. It constrained. Once named, it occupied a defined place in my awareness, and that place felt dangerous to maintain. The forest around me began to feel less like terrain and more like context. Trees, slopes, and clearings arranged themselves as if in support of a larger structure that I could not see in full. I noticed how often my line of sight was directed toward specific corridors, how my movement seemed guided into angles that favored observation from certain positions. This was not hurting in a physical sense. It was alignment, achieved without force. My fear deepened not through escalation but through refinement. The shaking subsided, replaced by a cold steadiness that left me acutely aware of every internal process. My heart rate slowed unnaturally. My breathing became shallow but controlled, as if my body had accepted a new baseline. The dread was no longer sharp. It was suffocating, continuous, a pressure that left no room for relief. I tested the boundaries cautiously. On one patrol, I deliberately avoided all known vantage points, keeping to dense cover and low ground. The sense of attention followed regardless. I felt watched without any corresponding sighting, a condition more distressing than visibility. When I stopped, the pressure increased. When I moved, it eased slightly, guiding me without direction. I understood then that avoidance was as informative as approach. The lights did not appear that night. Instead, the awareness intensified, a silent insistence that made my skin prickle and my muscles tighten. I realized that the lights were no longer required. They had served their purpose. The process had advanced beyond the need for markers. This realization left me feeling exposed in a way that no physical vulnerability could match. I became aware of my own thoughts as potential signals. When my attention drifted toward the designation I had given it, the pressure increased subtly, a reminder that focus itself carried consequence. I learned to think around the subject, to let related ideas dissolve before they could fully form. This self-censorship was exhausting, yet it felt necessary for continued function. On the following night, I sensed proximity without sight. The forest felt compressed, depth collapsing inward until every tree seemed equidistant. The air grew heavy, resistant to breath. I did not see creature name or designation, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was near, positioned just beyond the threshold of visibility. The knowledge produced a tremor that traveled through my legs and settled in my spine. I forced myself to remain still, resisting the urge to turn or flee. The fear of sudden movement outweighed the fear of remaining. My vision locked forward, unblinking, as if fixation could substitute for control. The understanding settled then, complete and irreversible. It was allowing proximity without manifestation, demonstrating that its presence did not depend on being seen. The realization stripped away the last of my rational defenses. This was not a creature encountered by chance, nor an anomaly awaiting explanation. It was an intentional entity, patient and aware, regulating the terms of engagement with precision. My role in this interaction was no longer passive observation. It was participation, compelled by recognition rather than choice. When the pressure finally eased, it did so gradually, releasing its hold in increments that felt measured. I did not move until the forest resumed its ordinary depth and sound. Even then, I understood that the encounter had not ended. It had progressed to a stage where absence no longer implied distance, and where intelligence no longer required visibility to assert itself. The explicit confrontation did not take the form I had expected, because by then expectation itself had been stripped away. There was no sudden emergence, no dramatic crossing of distance. Instead, it occurred as a convergence of awareness so complete that separation became meaningless. I was on patrol at the edge of a familiar drainage when the forest's depth collapsed again, not gradually this time, but decisively, as if a condition had been met. I felt the shift before I saw anything. My chest tightened, breath locking halfway between inhale and exhale. A tremor ran through my arms, fine and uncontrollable, while my legs went heavy, reluctant to respond. The ground beneath my boots felt distant, as though my sense of weight had been delayed. I stopped without choosing to stop, posture fixed by something other than will. It stood within clear view, closer than any previous sighting, no longer obscured by trunks or shadow. Creature name or designation occupied the open ground with an ease that erased any remaining doubt. The upright posture was absolute, balanced in a way that mocked human stance. Its height exceeded that of any man I had known, yet it did not loom. It simply existed at scale, proportioned for a world slightly misaligned with my own. The physiognomy resolved with brutal clarity. The face was broad and flattened, the structure heavy, the planes wrong in a way that resisted immediate description. The mouth was narrow, closed, with no visible tension or slackness, as if expression were an unnecessary concept. The eyes were set deep, larger than human, their surfaces dull and absorptive, reflecting nothing, offering no hint of emotion. Yet their focus was exact, fixed on me with an attention that felt invasive. The skin was thick, uneven in texture, bearing ridges and depressions that suggested long adaptation rather than injury. Its color absorbed what little light remained, rendering it almost featureless until the eye adjusted. There was no sign of hair or fur in the way animals possess it, only a dense surface that seemed grown for exposure, resilient and indifferent. The impression was not of decay, but of age without deterioration. Its limbs hung at its sides with deliberate stillness. The arms were elongated beyond human proportion, the joints positioned in a way that suggested a wider range of motion than was being displayed. The hands were large, the fingers long and articulated, resting without tension, capable of precision. Nothing about its stance indicated preparation for attack. That restraint carried its own threat. Movement, when it occurred, was minimal and devastating in effect. A slight tilt of the head, a fractional adjustment of weight, executed without sound or visible effort. The transition defied the expectations of muscle and momentum. It was as if the body responded directly to intent, bypassing the delays inherent in physical systems. I felt my stomach drop, a wave of nausea forcing saliva into my mouth as my vision blurred at the edges. I realized then that this was not an encounter meant to frighten through aggression. It was an assertion. Creature name or designation was making itself known under conditions it controlled entirely. The fear that filled me was not of harm but of correction, of having crossed into a state that required response. My body shook despite my efforts to still it, teeth clenched to prevent sound, breath forced into shallow rhythm. The knowledge settled with crushing weight, it knew exactly how much I could endure. The distance, the clarity, the duration, all calibrated with precision. It was not observing to learn. It was observing to confirm. My recognition had reached a point that demanded acknowledgement in return. I could not look away. The act felt prohibited, as if withdrawal of sight would constitute a violation more severe than continued exposure. At the same time, I was acutely aware that prolonged observation carried its own risk, that there was a boundary I was nearing without knowing how it was defined. The tension between these certainties was suffocating, compressing thought until only sensation remained. The encounter ended without closure. There was no retreat, no departure. One moment it occupied the space before me, the next, the space was empty, restored with impossible completeness. The transition left me swaying, my balance compromised, my legs threatening to fail. I remained standing only through rigid concentration, my entire body trembling in the aftermath. When I finally regained enough control to move, I did so with the understanding that this confrontation had not been a warning in the traditional sense. It had been a boundary adjustment. I had been allowed to see, to recognize, and in doing so, I had been altered in a way that could not be undone by distance or denial. The consequence was not immediate, and that delay was part of its weight. In the days following the confrontation, nothing overt occurred. No further sightings. No lights. No compression of space. The forest resumed its ordinary patterns with a thoroughness that felt deliberate. Animals moved as expected. Sound behaved correctly. Depth returned to its familiar logic. On the surface, the situation appeared resolved. The change manifested instead through absence. A fellow ranger assigned to an adjacent sector failed to report in after a routine patrol. His vehicle was found where he had left it, keys in the ignition, radio functional, no sign of struggle. The area showed no disturbance beyond the ordinary confusion of forest floor. Officially, it became a search and rescue case, then a missing person file, then a quiet administrative closure. Unofficially, it settled into the spaces between conversations, unspoken but present. I reviewed the timelines privately and felt a tightening behind my eyes as patterns emerged. His patrol route intersected one of the corridors where the lights had appeared earlier in the season. He had mentioned, weeks before, that the woods felt attentive, then laughed it off. The last transmission from his radio contained no distress, only a pause, a fraction of silence longer than normal, before the channel cleared. I was instructed not to participate in the search. The reasoning was logistical, delivered without elaboration. I accepted it outwardly while understanding inwardly that this exclusion was itself a consequence. Whatever adjustment had occurred during my confrontation had recalibrated my role. I was no longer positioned to intervene. I was being managed. The knowledge produced a hollowing sensation in my chest, a dull ache that did not resolve with breath. I experienced a persistent weakness in my limbs, not enough to impair function, but sufficient to remind me of vulnerability. My sleep deteriorated further, punctuated by sudden awakenings accompanied by the certainty that something irreversible had occurred, even if I could not name it directly. I began to understand that the disappearance was not an act of violence in the way humans define it. There were no signs of struggle because struggle had not been required. The removal was clean, precise, and final. The forest had not resisted. It had accommodated. The implication settled heavily. Proximity and recognition carried different consequences depending on thresholds crossed. I tested myself cautiously, approaching areas that had once drawn attention. There was nothing to see, nothing to feel. The absence was complete, and that completeness was itself a signal. I realized that, creature name or designation, no longer required my observation. Whatever correction had been necessary had already been applied. The weight of this understanding pressed inward, manifesting as a constant fatigue that no rest alleviated. My thoughts moved more slowly. My emotional responses flattened. I felt detached from outcomes that would previously have mattered deeply. This was not numbness born of shock. It was recalibration, a narrowing of internal range to prevent further overextension. I did not speak of my suspicions regarding the missing ranger. There was no framework in which to place them that would not mark me as compromised. Silence became both shield and sentence. The knowledge remained contained, heavy and immobile, exerting pressure simply by existing. Over time, the incident faded from official memory. New assignments replaced old ones. Reports accumulated. The missing man's name ceased to be mentioned. Yet the consequence persisted in ways that could not be documented, a vacancy in the landscape, a subtle but permanent absence that altered how space itself felt. I understood then that the irreversible consequence was not limited to disappearance or loss. It extended to those who remained, altered by proximity to something that corrected imbalances without explanation. Survival had not been granted freely. It had been conditional, and the conditions continued to assert themselves long after the visible event had concluded. Withdrawal was framed as reassignment, delivered through standard channels with language so ordinary it bordered on insulting. Budget adjustments. Coverage redistribution. A need elsewhere that matched my experience profile. The timing was precise enough to erase coincidence. I was instructed to vacate the station within 72 hours and to leave all field materials behind. The directive emphasized continuity, as if nothing were being interrupted. Packing felt like dismantling a structure that had already been hollowed. The station yielded its contents without resistance, maps and tools returning to crates with a neutrality that mirrored the forest's earlier compliance. I experienced a persistent lightheadedness during the process, a faint pressure at the base of my skull that intensified whenever I lingered. I learned to work quickly, efficiently, without reflection. On my final patrol, conducted in full daylight and under the guise of routine turnover, I avoided the areas that had once drawn attention. The avoidance felt correct, as if the boundaries had been redrawn and I was now expected to recognize them without confirmation. The forest presented no obstacles. It did not close or resist. It simply existed, complete and indifferent, as though my presence no longer registered. I noted the absence of any finality. There was no concluding sign, no last appearance, no gesture that could be interpreted as farewell or warning. The lack itself carried meaning. Engagement had ended not because it was resolved, but because it was no longer required. I was being extracted from relevance. The men who arrived to inventory the station were not the same ones who had questioned me earlier, but their manner shared the same quality of practiced neutrality. They asked no questions beyond procedural necessity. They did not inquire about my experience. They did not request a debrief. Their interest was limited to ensuring that records were complete and properly archived, a process that involved removing certain documents from circulation without comment. When I left the area, the transition was anticlimactic. The road descended out of timber and into open land, the forest receding in my mirrors without distortion or delay. I felt no relief. The pressure that had defined my days did not dissipate with distance. It remained, attenuated but present, a reminder that proximity was not measured solely in miles. In my new assignment, the routines were familiar, the environment predictable. Yet I found myself hesitating at thresholds, doorways, trailheads, changes in elevation, with an instinctive caution I could not suppress. My body retained a memory that did not require conscious recall. It responded to spaces as if they might respond in turn. I avoided night work whenever possible, citing fatigue that was both real and unprovable. In darkness, I experienced the same compression of attention, the same fear of misdirected focus. Lights in the distance, however ordinary, produced a tightening in my chest that took hours to ease. I learned to keep my gaze low, my thoughts diffuse. The abandonment of the original site became official months later, attributed to resource consolidation. The station was closed, the area folded into a broader administrative zone. No mention was made of unusual activity. The closure felt like a sealing rather than a departure, an effort to limit access rather than to conclude an operation. I understood then that withdrawal did not imply escape. It implied compliance. I had been removed from a position where further recognition might occur, relocated into a context where attention could be regulated more easily. The system had adjusted around me, and I had adjusted in response, each accommodation reinforcing the other. By the time the reassignment settled into routine, I no longer questioned its necessity. The acceptance came quietly, without justification. I had been extracted not to be protected, but to ensure that what had been recognized would not be recognized again under the same conditions. The abandonment was not of place, but of engagement, and it carried with it the unspoken understanding that some thresholds, once crossed, require permanent retreat rather than resolution. The aftermath did not announce itself as trauma. There were no acute episodes that could be isolated and treated. Instead, the change embedded itself gradually, reshaping my internal landscape in ways subtle enough to evade diagnosis. I remained functional. I fulfilled my duties. Yet beneath this surface continuity, something fundamental had narrowed, a contraction of inner space that left little room for uncertainty or wonder. I noticed first the erosion of curiosity. Questions that once would have drawn my attention now stalled before fully forming. I found myself resisting speculation instinctively, steering my thoughts away from abstraction as if it carried risk. This was not intellectual fatigue. It was avoidance refined to the level of reflex, a mental posture that favored stability over inquiry. My dreams remained absent. Sleep came and went without imagery, leaving me with the sense of having been suspended rather than restored. When I woke, there was often a lingering pressure in my chest, a residual tightness that eased only after hours of conscious breathing. Medical evaluations revealed nothing abnormal. The body, it seemed, was responding to conditions not represented in standard metrics. I became increasingly aware of thresholds in everyday life. The moment before entering a building. The pause at the edge of a clearing. The hesitation before turning a corner. Each carried a faint echo of the forest's earlier insistence, a reminder that boundaries are not always marked by signs or fences. I learned to respect these hesitations without understanding them, trusting the restraint they imposed. Emotion flattened into a narrower band. I was not depressed. I was not numb. I simply experienced less variation. Joy arrived muted. Anxiety rarely spiked. The extremes had been filed down, leaving a steady, manageable interior climate. This stability was functional, even desirable, yet it carried the faint sense of something relinquished in exchange. I avoided discussions of unexplained phenomena, not out of skepticism but out of a recognition that language itself can function as a form of attention. When such topics arose, I disengaged politely, redirecting conversation toward concrete matters. Friends noticed the change and attributed it to age or experience. I did not correct them. Occasionally, in moments of inattention, a memory would surface unbidden, the depth collapsing, the stillness of that upright form, the certainty of being assessed. These recollections did not provoke panic. They produced a tightening, a reminder of alignment that settled quickly back into place. The system, whatever it was, maintained itself without effort. I understood then that survival had not been a victory. It had been an adjustment. The long-term consequence was not fear, but limitation, a recalibration of how much of the world I was permitted to notice without consequence. This limitation did not feel imposed from outside. It felt accepted, internalized, enforced by my own caution. The absence of further encounters confirmed nothing. It simply reinforced the idea that engagement had been conditional and finite. Whatever threshold I had crossed had been corrected, and the correction held. There was no incentive for repetition. The process had achieved its aim. I continued my work until retirement without incident. Colleagues came and went. Procedures evolved. The world changed in ways both subtle and overt. Through it all, I carried the quiet certainty that some forms of knowledge are not meant to expand, that recognition itself can function as a boundary rather than a bridge. The psychological aftermath did not diminish with time. It stabilized, becoming a fixed parameter of my inner life. I learned to operate within it efficiently, even comfortably. Yet beneath that comfort lay the understanding that this stability was maintained by restraint, and that restraint had been learned under conditions I could never safely revisit. By the end of my career, I no longer framed the experience as something that had happened to me. It had become something that had happened through me, a moment where alignment had been enforced and then withdrawn, leaving behind a quieter, narrower way of being. The realization settled without drama, heavy and complete, preparing me for the final reframing I had long avoided. The final reframing arrived not as insight but as acceptance, settling into place with the inevitability of something that had always been true. Time had dulled none of the edges, it had merely clarified their shape. Distance, reassignment, and routine had not restored separation. They had only redistributed it, allowing me to live without further incident while preserving the conditions that made incident unnecessary. I came to understand that the location in Idaho had never been the containment. It had been a threshold, a convergence where attention could be guided and measured with precision. The forest, the lights, the staged allowances of visibility, all had functioned as instruments rather than causes. The mechanism was portable. It did not belong to the land. The land had been selected. The correction had not been punitive. It had been instructional, applied with restraint and exactness. I had not been attacked because attack was unnecessary. I had been permitted to see until seeing itself constituted imbalance. The adjustment that followed was not removal from existence but recalibration of awareness, a narrowing that ensured compatibility with continued function. This understanding explained the absence of pursuit, the lack of closure, the quiet extraction. Once the correction had been applied, proximity no longer mattered. I carried the result within me, a modified relationship to perception that rendered further engagement redundant. The entity, creature name or designation, did not need to remain near. It had never been bound by place. Recognition, I understood at last, had been the true point of no return. Not belief. Not fear. Recognition as alignment, as the act of meeting an intelligence on terms precise enough to be acknowledged in return. That exchange had completed something, not for it, but for me. The cost had been subtle and enduring, paid in the currency of narrowed attention and regulated thought. I realized then that others had likely crossed similar thresholds elsewhere, under different conditions, corrected in ways that left no shared language. The system did not require secrecy. It required compliance, achieved not through suppression but through adjustment. Those who were corrected continued. Those who were removed did not. Both outcomes served the same end. There was no lesson to extract, no warning to issue. Moral framing was irrelevant. What had occurred operated outside such structures, guided by criteria that did not intersect with human values. The restraint, the patience, the deliberate allowance of sight, all indicated an intelligence unconcerned with explanation and uninterested in domination. Its authority derived from alignment, not force. I no longer wondered what might have happened had I acted differently. The question assumed choice where none had meaning. The sequence had unfolded as it was intended to unfold, contingent not on action but on recognition. Once that threshold had been crossed, the outcome was fixed, regardless of response. In quiet moments, I sometimes sensed the faint echo of that original pressure, not as threat but as confirmation that the adjustment held. It did not feel like surveillance. It felt like balance maintained. The world remained vast and unknowable, but my access to certain depths had been curtailed with care. This account was never meant for release because release would imply resolution, and there is none. What remains is not mystery but boundary, established and enforced without spectacle. The entity was never confined to the woods. The encounter occurred because a threshold was crossed. I was not attacked, but corrected. And recognition, once granted and returned, proved to be the only point beyond which nothing could be restored to what it had been. I am aware that setting this down extends the record beyond what was ever required, yet omission would suggest that something ended when it did not. What concluded in Idaho was not an event but a phase of engagement, and phases imply continuity rather than closure. This account exists only to mark that distinction, to preserve the shape of what followed without implying resolution. Life resumed in forms recognizable enough to pass without comment. Days accumulated. Seasons turned. Responsibilities were met. Yet every routine action carried a faint after-pressure, a sense that I was operating within parameters subtly but permanently revised. Nothing forced compliance. Compliance had become inherent. I learned that restraint could feel indistinguishable from wisdom. Friends described me as measured, careful, grounded. They were not wrong. What they could not see was the internal calculus that preceded each decision, the instinctive evaluation of whether attention itself might constitute trespass. I lived well within those margins. There were moments, rare and unguarded, when I considered what might lie beyond those margins. The thought never fully formed. It dissolved under a familiar internal pressure, gentle and absolute. Curiosity had become negotiable only up to a certain depth, and I respected that limit without resentment. I did not seek corroboration. The idea of comparison felt inappropriate, as if aligning experiences might create resonance where silence was required. Whatever system governed the correction did not depend on isolation, but isolation ensured efficiency. Each adjustment stood alone, complete in itself. The absence of fear was perhaps the most unsettling aspect. Fear implies threat, and threat implies potential escalation. What remained instead was awareness moderated by acceptance, a condition that allowed for continuity without disturbance. It was not peace. It was equilibrium. I understood, eventually, that this equilibrium was not maintained through vigilance but through surrender of excess perception. By not looking too closely, by not pursuing certain lines of thought, I preserved function. The cost was subtle but cumulative, paid in relinquished depth rather than overt loss. This is why the account was never intended for circulation. Documentation invites engagement. Engagement invites recognition. Recognition carries consequence. What I recorded here is not a warning but a boundary description, useful only to the extent that it remains contained. I have not seen the lights again. I have not felt the compression of space or the deliberate allowance of sight. The absence does not indicate safety. It indicates completion. The condition that required intervention no longer applies, because it has been corrected at its source. If there is any finality to be found, it lies in the understanding that what occurred was neither anomaly nor aberration. It was procedure, executed with patience and restraint, indifferent to interpretation. The intelligence involved did not seek dominance or concealment. It sought alignment. I continue to live within that alignment. It does not announce itself. It does not intrude. It simply holds, quiet and sufficient, ensuring that what was recognized remains recognized only once. Nothing calls me back to that threshold, and I do not approach it again. This concludes the account not because the matter has ended, but because further articulation would imply an invitation that no longer exists. The correction stands. The balance holds. And what was seen, having been allowed once, requires no repetition to remain permanently known.